Now please welcome to the podium Douglas Elmendorf. He's the Dean of the Kennedy School here at Harvard.
Good afternoon. I am honored to welcome David Lammy to the weekly colloquium of the W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute. David is the member of the British Parliament for Tottenham, which he has represented since 2000, and a member of the British Labour Party. David uses the slogan, "From Tottenham for Tottenham," which gives you a sense of his perspective on his life of public service. David will speak to us today on the persistence of race and class in political discourse in Britain. And we could not ask for a more enlightening speaker on this important topic. I'm delighted that I have the chance to be here today and glad to see all of you here as well. David Lammy was one of 5 children raised by a single mother in Tottenham. He studied law at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, was called to the bar of England and Wales, practiced as a barrister, and came to Harvard Law School, where he received an LLM degree. He was the first black Briton to take an LLM at Harvard Law School. And since then, we're lucky he has been a frequent visitor to the United States and to Harvard. He's the author of 2 books, another on the way he just mentioned to me. He wrote a book in 2002 titled Leading Together, A New Vision for Leadership on Race, and a book in 2012 titled Out of the Ashes, Britain After the Riots. David's career in Parliament has drawn its power from both his elite education and his more humble beginnings. Between 2002 and 2010, David served as a minister in the last Labour government, including as culture minister, higher education minister, and health minister, and he was appointed to the Privy Council in 2008. He has accomplished a great deal, even as a backbencher, leading successful campaigns for increased diversity in education, including at Oxford and Cambridge, for restoration of youth work programs, and for limiting privatization by keeping the land registry in public hands. David has also been a very strong opponent of Brexit. I want to highlight briefly 3 specific issues where David has made an important difference in the past few years. 3 issues closely related to his topic for us today. The first involves the criminal justice system. In 2016, then Prime Minister David Cameron asked David to lead an independent review into the treatment of blacks, Asians, and members of other ethnic minority groups in the British criminal justice system. The Lammy Review was published in September 2017 and included 35 wide-ranging policy recommendations for changes in the criminal justice system. The second issue I want to highlight is the horrific fire that many of you remember that occurred in June 2017 in the Grenfell Towers in Tottenham. The fire killed 71 people, mostly immigrants. David has taken the lead in fighting for justice for them and for their families, calling out the builders, the building managers, and government regulators for their negligence. And the third issue to mention involves members of the so-called Windrush Generation. If you saw the flyer for the talk today, you see a picture of a ship. The Windrush Generation are people from various countries in the British Commonwealth who came to the United Kingdom as full British citizens between 1948 and 1973. Recently, a number of members of the Windrush Generation have been detained, threatened with deportation, in some cases actually deported, and denied the full rights of British citizens, which they are. The Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, resigned as a result of these developments, and David continues to be at the forefront of championing the Windrush Generation to ensure that they receive the rights to which they are entitled. Last week, David was presented with the Politician of the Year Award at the GQ Men's of the Year Awards in London in recognition of his passion, his conviction, and his effectiveness as a public servant. That commitment last week explains why he was not here with us to kick off the semester, but we are thrilled to have him here today. It is my privilege and pleasure to welcome the Right Honorable David Lammy back to Harvard this afternoon.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a really wonderful obituary, and I'm still here. It's really fantastic to be back at Harvard again. I can't quite believe it was 21 years since I was a student here. And it was great. I just got a taxi into Harvard Square, and when I was a student, for some reason, I didn't like hanging out with lawyers. So I used to try and escape the law school, and I decided that the library I best liked to be in was Lamont. So it's sort of great to be back in the Lamont zone 21 years later. At that time when I was here, it was, change was coming. Harvard was setting up its sort of first email accounts for students. There were huge innovations and everybody seemed to be participating, and one of them was that suddenly everyone was wearing Birkenstocks. Nothing has changed. And politically, it was a period of O.J. Simpson, Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, and Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. So that was the age. Here we are 2 decades later. And it's interesting, I mean, I've been to America nearly every year since that period to see how much has changed and how much hasn't changed. And I'll touch on a bit of that, but I'm here at a tremendously global time. And I guess it's important to say that when I say as a member of Parliament that I am from Tottenham and for Tottenham, I am including in that wider definition of Tottenham a kind of conversation that connects the Black diasporic community across the global world, has deep affinity with the global south of our world as well, and therefore it's not just Tottenham, it is Brixton in London, it is Moss Side in Manchester, it is Kingston, Jamaica, it is Harlem in the United States, it is Cleveland in Mississippi, it is a whole range of communities that I have spent time in, that I have some deep affinity to, and connects the subject of this discussion in a British context, and that is that perennial issue of race and of class. And of course, I'm very, very conscious that I am being asked to do this colloquium at a dangerous and an extraordinary time in our global history, in which the very urgent threat of those who would sweep all that we gained in the 20th century under the carpet, or indeed to exclude and annihilate, is very, very, very real. And what I mean by that is that something I learned at Harvard and my time here was really the major story of the 20th century was that story of self-affirmation and the ability to affirm in that century, by the end of that century, and to begin to take steps to be who you want to be. So it was in the 20th century that women really began to find their voice. The beginning of that century, many being denied the right to even vote. Certainly in the middle of the century, very little control over your body, the invention of the pill and other things. But by the end of the 20th century, women, ethnic minorities, and people of color all over the world pushing off the shackles of colonialism, apartheid, Jim Crow and segregation, beginning to step out and say, I want to be this in my lifetime. That is the major story of the advances, the progressive advances that we made as people in the 20th century. And of course, there's a long list. LGBTQ would fit with that, disability, mental health, and much, much more to be done. And I suppose I'm speaking at a point in which those struggles to give rights to workers, get them out of factories and mines in Europe and the industrial world, those fights alongside development, those fights for women, those fights for ethnic minorities and people of color, at this point, which we simply could not have predicted when I was here 21 years ago, we are in danger of seeing all of it roll back. All of it roll back, and that's why this particular institution is so important in that global discussion. Now, to bring you right zap up to date with the intersection of race and class in the United Kingdom, I just want to play you a 10-minute video that can act as the backdrop, if you like, to what I might be saying, and sort of cuts right to the chase of politics at this time. The only thing it leaves out is the Brexit discussion. I don't think I need to remind you about that you will have come across all of that in the news. So I want you to juxtapose Brexit alongside Windrush and Grenfell to fully comprehend where we are in the UK at this time. And all through much that I'm saying, I want you to hold in your mind's eye, because of this axis between the Anglo-American world, Trump, Charlottesville, and a whole host of the other nightmares that are being visited on this great country. Because you know, I hope this audience understands, that they are all inextricably linked. Great.
A generation of Brits who came here as children have been facing the threat of deportation from the UK. So what? They went to British schools, they worked British jobs, they built British lives. But recently, some were denied healthcare, lost jobs, were detained and faced being thrown out of their country. They are the Windrush generations. So what is the Windrush generation? Between 1948 through to the late 60s, more than 500,000 people came to the UK from the Caribbean. It was the first wave of Commonwealth immigration. They were invited over by the British government to work in public services and help rebuild the country after the Second World War.
Where do you come from?
Jamaica.
Have you brought your children with you?
Yes,
How many?
5 children.
Those children who came here are now pensioners. People like Michael Braithwaite, who left Barbados when he was 9. He was told he was illegal after reapplying for his job in a school, a job which he then lost because he couldn't show the right paperwork.
Do I belong where I am? for what I've been here all this time, and to be put in that position, it sort of made me feel like I'm an alien, basically, or I have no status.
Another who has suffered is Hubert Leslie. He came from Jamaica on his mum's passport and found himself out of work as a maintenance man because the Home Office had declared him an illegal immigrant.
I feel like an alien in this country. Yeah, because if I've worked and lived in this country for a long time and the Home Office would come and look at me and tell me that I've got no status in this country and I've worked and I've paid my tax.
So what led to the threats of deportation? It's really important to know that the Windrush Generation have been living here legally. Tougher immigration rules were brought in by Theresa May when she was Home Secretary, where, in her own words, a hostile environment was created to expel illegal immigrants. Remember those vans? The problem is that a lot of the Windrush generations never applied for a British passport when they arrived here, because back then the kids would have travelled on their parents' passports when they came to this country. When their parents or grandparents passed away, they were then left with no ID of their own. Anthony Bryan came to the UK from Jamaica with his family in 1965. At only 7 years old, he arrived on his brother's passport. When he recently tried to apply for his own British passport to visit his mum in Jamaica, he had no proof of ID, so immigration came knocking.
They said I'm illegal. Their job is to remove me out of the country. They had a plane ticket for me. And I phoned my missus and I said to her, they tell me that they got a plane ticket for me and they're going to remove me out of the country.
Anthony is actually one of the lucky ones. He recently found out that he's allowed to stay in his country. When immigration rules changed in 1971, anyone from the Windrush generation living in the UK was automatically given indefinite leave to remain. But the Home Office didn't keep a record of those people, and it's estimated more than 50,000 may not have registered their right to live here. So what did they have to do to stay? To prove they're living legally in the country, they were asked to provide at least one document, sometimes more, like a payslip, medical record, bank statement for every year that they've been in the country. That could mean finding a doctor's note from 50 years ago. I mean, would you be able to find one from 3 years ago, let alone half a century? For most, the UK is the only home they know. Until now, they have never questioned whether they belonged here.
These individuals, having been here from childhood, had no sense in their minds that they're not British. And that is really the tragedy of it.
So what has been decided? A U-turn was made after Theresa May was urged by at least 140 MPs across Parliament to change this policy. More than 130,000 people signed a petition asking the government to grant the Windrush generation amnesty. Labour's David Lammy made an impassioned speech to the Home Secretary Amber Rudd in the Commons.
This is a day of national shame, and it has come about because of a hostile environment policy that was begun under her Prime Minister.
The UK Immigration Minister, Caroline Noakes, admits that terrible mistakes have been made.
These are people who we welcomed here way back in the 50s and 60s, and it's really important to me that we correct any error and that we send a message of reassurance to people who are here. We want to get this right for them.
Theresa May has apologised to Commonwealth leaders for the anxiety caused over the controversy. That's probably a good sign for people here. The only problem is that some people might have already been deported. So what happens next? A Windrush task force has now been set up by the Home Secretary Amber Rudd to address the situation. But the Home Office has stressed the importance of a robust immigration policy to root out those who actually are here illegally. Given the attention this story has got, it's likely the government will find a solution to this issue. But for the Windrush generation, will it really make up for the way that many of their lives were turned upside down? Some people reckon this is a possible glimpse into what could happen after Britain leaves the European Union. Now obviously the status of migrants from Europe is a totally different situation to the Windrush generation. But this whole thing has raised questions and concerns over how the Home Office will cope with the changes to the immigration system. I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
idea of having cameras available to my mum who could document my life sort of growing up. I've always been the subject of the camera. I think back in the day I was very like a flamboyant child. I'd always be posing, which it's sort of changed now. I'm more comfortable behind the camera. I've become a lot more cautious and aware of the power that the camera holds. So even looking at my area and how much it's changed in terms of the building developments, and I can look back at photos and see how quickly the spaces changed in the matter of like 10 years. That was an extreme contrast to my area in Loughborough Grove. So it was a big culture shock having to adapt to a very different lifestyle that I felt very much on the outside, because everyone sort of grew up in this sort of like opulence and opportunities and the sky is the limit. I wanted to do photography, but I was sort of fighting it because I felt it's not something I should do. It's something I should do on the side. But having such supportive teachers that actually led me to pursue that, and yeah, I'm very grateful to them, because if not, I wouldn't be here. Both my parents are from Gambia, and my mother is Christian and my father is Muslim. So this idea of having these dual faiths and being brought up going to the mosque and going to church, it's always been something I've always found fascinating, and it's one of the first times I've been able to explore it through my photography. Very strange, because I woke up to people speaking Italian outside my window, and it just clicked. I was like, oh no, I'm not at home. I'm not in Loughborough Grove anymore. And one of my friends said, you're an artist. And I was like, I am now. It will be quite an emotional moment to actually say, Khadija, you've done it. It's, you're up there, all this work and this emotional journey and self-doubt and wanting to pack it in, and it's going to come together, and yeah, I just can't wait, really. I'm excited to show her the work. She's extremely proud, and she's been telling everyone that, oh, my daughter's going to Venice. I'm not giving up here, and she won't give up either.
I'm very privileged that my wife is a woman called Nicola Green, and she is an internationally acclaimed artist, and she's the artist behind the Black Diaspora Pavilion that was set up at Venice. Khadija Say was one of my wife's interns, and so I dedicate much that I say in her memory and wanted to bring her into the room. A young woman with her life ahead of her, of Gambian descent, who lost her life on the 20th floor of Grenfell Tower in a preventable fire, because despite the opportunity to attend a prestigious private school, to go to university, to mentor with a woman like my wife, that agency that she could and should have had to get out of that building, a building that had no sprinklers, extinguishers, and all the rest of it that led to the deaths of those people, she did not possess. And so there is a story that connects back to colonial times, that Gambian heritage that you hear there, Jamaican, Bajan heritage that you hear in that Windrush story, that connects to a story in a city like London. It's very present in Boston. It's present in places like New York. I will be in Oakland in November, and I know I'll see it there. And that is whose regeneration or gentrification? Who is this for in this new world and this new horizon? I remember when I was at Harvard Law School, in the middle of the noughties it was, a black alumni had come together, and at that time I was a young minister in Tony Blair's government. And in the way that Harvard alumni connect, whatever period at which they've been at a particular school, I was there at this Black alumni event on this occasion with two African-American young aspiring politicians that made a beeline for me. The conversation being, what's it like being in Tony Blair's government? We've got Bush here. Tell us what it's like, David. Those two young aspiring politicians were Deval Patrick and Barack Obama. And the backdrop of the conversation was also what had literally just happened, Hurricane Katrina, and a story about people who could not get out of a city because they didn't have a car. People who could not easily provide for themselves in those early days after the floods because of means and ability to have food and keep food and other things. That story, which is a story of agency, it connects to what I said at the very beginning of my talk. The real story of the 20th century is that ability to self-affirm, to self-actualize. You can be a young child in Harlem, in Tottenham, in Nairobi or Lagos. You can be a woman, you can be gay, and as we take steps out of that century, you can actually be what you want to be. But yet, as we sit here in 2018, this business of agency, who am I? What am I? My ability to move. Well, here in this elite environment, we all possess that. But I think we know that there are many, 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 many millions of people across the world who do not possess that. And what I want to talk about is why. Who is holding on to power and why, to get to the heart of this. So let me go back to Windrush first of all, and the presentation that you saw. I am absolutely a child of that Windrush period. My father arrived in Britain in 1956. He was a beneficiary of that 1948 Nationality Act. Now, you saw in the presentation a narrative story that is very common in the UK. It's how the media tell the story. It's how the government tells the story. And I want to interrogate that story. And the story is, we invited these West Indians to come to Britain. They heard the call, and they came to help us rebuild Britain after the war from 1948 onwards. There's a sense in which they were active immigrants, heard the call, economic, come to the motherland, as they call it, the mother country, and help us rebuild after the war. My father came on an assisted passage scheme. He aspired to be a pharmacist, but he came on a scheme that had him working as a taxidermist in a factory in London in an age in which we still stuffed animals from the empire and held them up as trophies. My mother came later. I'll come back to her in a minute, but she came much later in 1970. A little younger than my father, at the end of this critical period. Now, let's come back to the 1948 British Nationality Act. This act was designed to ensure that right across the Commonwealth, people could have a right of settlement in the mother country. It was sort of enshrined there in law in 1948, that wherever you were across the, the pink bits of the atlas, the British Empire, you could come. But the truth was, when Parliament passed the Act and people thought of who would come, they were thinking of largely what was described as the Times as the white dominions. They were thinking of people coming from Australia and New Zealand, white South Africans, who could come and settled, have family in the UK, people of wealth and substance who could have a right to settlement. They were not thinking of black and brown Indians and West Indians and Africans. They were poor. They wouldn't be able to afford the passage. They were workers. Don't worry, Winston Churchill, Clem Attlee, the black and brown people won't be coming. It will be the white folk coming. That was really the basis of the 1948 Act. And so very quickly after the war, when Britain had been decimated by Hitler's bombs, there was a huge new housing program across the country to house people as London was coming out of the rubble of the Second World War. As is often the case with war, when aristocrats, men of privilege and education go to war alongside the mass of the poor, the working class, the rural, there was also coming out of that war a new vision. That vision, a vision that is still debatable here in the United States, was to give the country a national health service, a new welfare system, and immigrants would be needed from the Commonwealth to staff that national health service. And so my mother and others were part of that generation coming to work in the NHS, also to work in our transport system, our London Underground, our tube network, and our national rail system. What you don't hear in the narrative story, of course, of that Nationality Act and that Windrush is why there was this pull to come. Why were all these West Indians leaving? Well, the story of Windrush, as I said in Parliament, did not begin in 1948. The story of Windrush began 400 years earlier. It is a story of empire, colonialism, and slavery. That's the real story. These people came as British citizens because the decision to make them British was taken 400, 300, 200 years earlier. They were British subjects. When my ancestors were taken from the west coast of Africa and taken across the Atlantic, we became Britain's problem. They left the Caribbean because after the end of the slave trade, in the first the abolition of slavery in 1807 and then the actual trade in 1833, I'm afraid it was a good 60 years later here in the United States. But after the end of that period, the Caribbean largely became a warehouse. It became a problem. Lots of these former slaves in this area where Britain had extracted tremendous wealth, sugar, aluminium, all the resources of the Caribbean, possibilities in the Caribbean, but they were stuck with these former slaves in this empire. There was widespread unemployment, widespread labour shortages, widespread revolts, and real issues with the unions. That's why young people like my father left. It was because he felt stuck and warehoused by the British, and that was the story of many in the French-speaking world and the Spanish-speaking, Portuguese-speaking world. And it's a story that very sadly Britain doesn't tell. And that comes right up to date, up to this Brexit story. You listen to these conservative ministers and they're talking about abandoning Europe. Forget Europe. We're going to strike trade deals with the rest of the world. Code for we are going to get our empire back. Not really recognizing that the trade deals that they may have had with the rest of the world back in those days of empire were trade deals secured by force and extraction and the deep manipulation of economies like the economy of India. These were not trade deals secured between equals. How different it's going to be if Britain does Brexit and goes to negotiate these trade deals. And what a lie Britain will have told. The Britain of Nigel Farage, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and Boris Johnson. Why do I say it's a lie? It's because I think that there were people who voted in the Brexit 2 years ago, who when they voted leave, we want to leave the European Union, in the back of their mind, some of them clearly felt that people like me might leave. Leave! Why are you here? This is not your country. As I said in Parliament, quoting the great Stuart Hall, I am the sugar in that British cup of tea. I am here because you were there. I ain't going anywhere. So these trade deals that will be struck, when we go to the Indians and say we want a trade deal, what's the first thing the Indians are going to ask for? The first thing on their list will be visas, immigration into the UK. So the very same lie that we told to so many British people that was bought, we're going to see an end to this immigration. Actually, it will accelerate as the Indians and the Chinese, who actually, in terms of bargaining power, will find a very weak United Kingdom to bargain with, will get their own way to have a trade. That tide of multiculturalism and globalism which Britain began because it was so good at inventing boats that didn't sink and managed to travel to the rest of the world. It is a tide that I'm afraid cannot now be shut. It's like a finger in the dam, and it ain't working. And so this story of colonialism is a hugely important story, and it's one that we do not hear. The national story of Britain is a story that is largely defined by the First and Second World War. If you're in a British school, you will learn about Henry VIII and his wives, and Elizabeth I. You will learn about the Industrial Revolution and that drive to create industry that was picked up here in the United States particularly, gave us white goods, electricity, and a whole range of innovations like the telephone. You will hear a lot about the First and the Second World War and how, with our American partners, we saved the world from the tyranny of Hitler. You will not hear, though, about the concentration camps that the United Kingdom set up during the Boer War in South Africa. You will not hear about the genocide of the Mau Mau in Kenya. You will not hear about the abysmal partition of India and the setting up of the problems with Kashmir and between Pakistan and India. You won't hear about the huge, immense issues that exist in the country of Afghanistan that ricochet across the world because of the United Kingdom. So much of so importance that are stories that never get told. I was asked by Tony Blair back in 2006. He made me the UK culture minister. The culture portfolio in European countries is an important one because the state funds our museums, it funds the BBC, it wants to be involved in the business that is culture. Unlike the United States where, obviously there's very rich culture, but it's largely a private, philanthropic domain, not a state issue. Anyway, he made me culture minister, and because of some political pressure within the Labour Party, a decision was taken that we would commemorate the abolition of slavery in 1807. Sorry, the slave trade, forgive me, the slave trade, you're quite right, in 1807. And I helped with the preparation for that commemoration. But I noted when I spoke to the museums, when I spoke to the universities, when I spoke to Westminster Abbey that put on a service and had to liaise with the royal family and, you know, the BBC and British public life about how the country was going to prepare for this. Tremendous nervousness. Tremendous nervousness. Also, unlike the United States, obviously a country yet to commemorate anything in relation to this story here in the United States. But unlike the United States, slavery and empire was something done away from the country. There is no national consciousness, really, that the country's wealth was built on this. There is not even any understanding of how and why the Americans kicked us out and why the Americans fought a civil war, never mind the War of Independence. That story is not told. This isn't, so in taking these steps to commemorate slavery, the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, this was a difficult moment for Britain. So how did it do it? Well, basically the system conspired to commemorate the abolition, but not the fact of slavery. So you find that Brits want to talk about Wilberforce, who abolished it. We led the world in abolishing slavery, and we did it so much, you know, before the United States, David. Didn't we do a good job? No one wants to talk about what happened during that period. This is important in terms of national consciousness. It's why when we get to the Windrush, we want to talk about people arriving in 1948, but we don't want to talk about why they came, how they came. The fact that Caribbean Indian soldiers served alongside white British soldiers in the First and Second World War. That story is not a story that easily is told. Lord Rosebery described the British Empire as the greatest secular agency for good the world has ever seen. Then there's that sort of great polemic imposter, Niall Ferguson, who also builds up this story of this benevolent empire and all it gave the world. He compares India in the period in which Britain was running that great country with India now. He talks, as an example, about the electrification of the country and the national grid. He laughs and jokes that today in India, a quarter of Indians, that's 300 million people, are without access to the grid, the electric grid. And he says, imagine if the UK still ran India. Everyone would have electricity. That's how bad things are in India now that the Brits have left. What he fails to tell you is that when the Brits were running India, whilst everyone in the UK had the electric grid, actually it was only about 1,200 villages that the Brits got the grid to. Way more has been done by the Indian government in the last 50 years that was done in India by Brits before. And you think of the continuing running down of Indian industry deliberately in that country, the manipulation of the economics of India to benefit the Brits and deny Indians the capacity to claim their country. So that is a story of empire which has been whitewashed. So whitewashed that Tony Blair, even in his own biography, describes standing in Hong Kong in 1997 as the Brits were handing Hong Kong back to the Chinese. This is how far empire stretched. And at that point, the Chinese president says, this is a moment where we can lay to rest the ghosts of the past. And Tony Blair's standing there and he says, and I was there thinking, I don't actually know what those ghosts are, because I know nothing of why Britain was in China in the first place. So we are telling ourselves a story today. It is a story that can be best personified by the story that Nigel Farage is telling. It's a story that uses words like deluge, swamped, to talk about immigration. It's a story that uses words like control, take back control, make our country great again. That is built on a myth. It is not the real story. And if you are not prepared to deal with those uncomfortable truths and those hard truths, then you are condemned to make the same mistakes again, aren't you? And it's a global story. It's why Banyan, Farage, Le Pen are joining up in a kind of gang across the world. Breitbart are setting up offices in Israel and London. Be under no doubt, this is a movement. Why is it when you look and see some of the footage from Charlottesville, are people talking and wearing the banners of white farmers in what they describe as Rhodesia? The story, of course, of South Africa and Zimbabwe and Southern Africa, remember, not entirely being, and I don't want to do any disservice to the great memory of Nelson Mandela, but it is to hold on to the idea that truth and reconciliation is not the only story of South Africa. There were others in that debate as South Africa emerged after apartheid. And in the year in which Winnie Mandela died, it's important to say that there were others that it certainly included Winnie Mandela, arguing that the real issue in Southern Africa is the issue of land. And the issue of land was left off the discussion in relation to truth and reconciliation. Land that is largely in the hands of those who came from the United Kingdom and from Holland and the Dutch settlements to make the new South Africa. Land that is held by white farmers, that those at Charlottesville were saying are entitled to have that land. That's why I talk about colonialism. That's why I connect this story to a story that, again, we want to confine to a small group of people who wear hoods or who put on Nazi uniforms, who are called white supremacists. And I want to suggest to you that that is not as small as people would like you to think that it is. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Let me come then to Khadija Say. and Grenfell Tower and those that lost their lives, and ask this audience to see that entirely as a similar event to the complex issues around Katrina, New Orleans at that particular point in time in this country. No real difference there. To think about the stories in your downtown areas of gentrification, who benefits, and of new forms of segregation. And to understand also something that, again, only really came to me 20 odd years ago when I was here at Harvard, and here I'm going to be very political. In Europe, there is this tradition, this fight back tradition. The progressive tradition is a tradition that is largely associated with left-wing politics and with socialism. It is the story of class that we juxtapose to the story of race. Here in the United States, the race discourse can sometimes feel that it is a singular discourse that is kind of just up here. Let me tell another story. I remember another occasion on which I came back to Harvard. I was again with some Black alumni and African American friends and alumni. Wonderful, wonderful time. And the debate that was going on at the time was a debate about Oprah Winfrey. Wonderful Oprah. And the debate was, how could it be that Oprah Winfrey is in Switzerland? Oprah Winfrey goes into a shop. She sees a beautiful, I think it was a crocodile skin handbag, costs over £1 million. And this woman refuses to take the handbag down, assumes that Oprah could not possibly want it or pay for it, and shuffles Oprah out of the shop. Racism in Switzerland, racism in Europe was the national, part of the national discourse here. To my ears, my European ears, my Black diasporic ears, that was not entirely the story I heard. Because I suppose as a Labour politician, part of a party that set up a movement to help working people self-actualize, I heard a slightly different story. And so all I could hear in the back of my head was my father, of course, coming over from the Caribbean. I told you about the way that things were run down in the Caribbean. The Caribbean, because of industry and sugar, and was very unionized. It was a way in which the blacks began to assert and get some power and managed to mobilize to kick out the British by the 1940s, 50s, 60s. That's a story across the Commonwealth. So there is this left socialist sensibility that runs through the heart of post-colonial studies and that fight against the Brits. So what did I hear my dad saying with that Oprah story that I wasn't really hearing here in the United States? I heard him saying, how the hell could Oprah think it was cool to buy a handbag for £1 million? I tell that story to say that race and class must always be posited together. And that brings you right up to date with where we are now. The truth is, when the global south is in pain, as it is in so many parts of the developing world, when parts of the Black diaspora are in pain, as they have been since the global crash of 2008. When it's the global south and black and brown people agitating and concerned at their position across society, on the whole, the G7, G8, G20, they don't really care that much. We're hearing a new story. It's a story that was, it's not that new actually, it's a very old story. It's a story that you would have heard if you were in the 1920s. There is a global story being told by Farage and Trump and Bannion and a lot of them and Le Pen. It is a story, and they use code words in Europe. Very simply, the white working class. Now the world cares. You see, in the European UK tradition, it's important. When Britain was enslaving much of the world and colonizing much of the world, it wasn't treating its white working class mass very well either. The aristocrats had people going down mines, working in workhouses. It was pretty grim. These are people who don't fully understand the story of empire. And so in my work, want to be part of a movement to resist this discussion of a white working class, as if working class people, now I hope this audience understands when we say working class, we mean poorer in a European context, are just white. They are not just white. Most working class people, there are more proportionately in Britain working class people who are black or brown. They're the people in Grenfell. So what we have to interrogate this decision to whitewash a class phrase and brush out black and brown people as part of this experience, part of this economic experience. When I said that Khadija Say, despite some opportunities, didn't have the agency to get out of the building, it was because when you're told when you're in one of those estates, stay put, the fire won't get to you, we will get to you. And you know what, working people, poor people, I remember when I was growing up poor, when someone in uniform told you to do something, you did it. And they told her and others to stay put, we will get you. And they failed to get you. There is a big inquiry into what happened in Grenfell, and I raised the issue of how it was in 2018. To lead this inquiry, Theresa May couldn't find one, not one, ethnic minority, judge, barrister, lawyer to lead this inquiry. Could you not find one barrister, judge, lawyer who has had any experience of public housing, has ever been into public housing? Oh, there was a hue and cry. David Lammy is being racist, they're saying. Racist. This word that has been adopted by the right to describe people like me, understanding that power must always be in any discussion of race. So the better phrase to use is to come back to that fringe phrase, but it's not a fringe phrase, white supremacy. To come back to that colonial period, to come back to people like Darwin, who described Eskimos, Aboriginals, Africans as savages, and is still one of the major foundations of biology, even here at esteemed Harvard. It's a hierarchy and a pecking order that was set up, that is real and lives today, and allows your President of the United States of America to describe the country from which my parents are from, Khadija Say's parents are from, and a whole raft of people come from as shitholes. It is a hierarchy. It is a white supremacist system. And the urgency of the 21st century is to dismantle it, to interrogate it, to describe it, and to call it what it is. If the 20th century was the century in which people began to self-affirm, to self-actualize in numbers, then it must be this century in which we speak a real truth. And it is the truth of that system that was set up by those old European powers. A system that they are trying now to reinvent, that we must call out for what it is. Because the truth is, and I learnt it, I know it's very, very deep in the heart of the American soul, this idea that we are all born equal. And I've thought about that phrase all of my life, because of course, as someone born in an inner city environment in London that I now represent, I want to say I am equal. But it's also part of that myth. Because the truth is, if you look at the evidence, I'm afraid we are not all born equal. I was asked by David Cameron to lead a review into the what you would call the mass incarceration of black and ethnic minorities in the United Kingdom. We call it the disproportionate numbers of blacks and ethnic minorities in our criminal justice system. I was very privileged to be resourced by the government of the UK to do this piece of work. It's online if you want to look it up. I travelled all around the world. I want to leave with you some of those findings. We need to ask ourselves why, because often in a country's prisons, you see the underbelly of the country. Why is it that the worst country in the world, which is not the United States, by the way, again, I want to have a little go at my American friends, bit insular, I love Michelle Phillips's book, but a little bit insular, the worst country in the world for mass incarceration is on the other side of the world, it's in Australia. It is horrific what the Australians do to Aboriginals, making up just 3% of the country and representing in the Northern Territories and Western Australia 70% of the prison population in that country, and no one says a word about these people and their plight. Setting up juvenile centres. Look up the Royal Commission that the government of Australia just had into systemic abuse of young children in their juvenile prison system. Then let's go next door to New Zealand, another one of those outflung places where the Brits got to. Better in New Zealand, similar to Canada, a better settlement for Indigenous people, but it is still the case that Maoris make up 50% of the prison population in New Zealand, similar to the numbers that we see in parts of Canada as well. More progressive, but a persistent problem with those black and brown people in those countries. Ask ourselves why, when we go to Britain's neighbour in France, and the French don't keep the records because we're all French, so we don't keep figures about race. But some academics have done the word 70% of the French prison system is occupied by what they call Arabs, what we would call people of Middle Eastern descent. So, this is the story. Are we really born equal? Why is London now got this knife crime, gang crime epidemic with more murders in the City of London than in New York? Why is Britain not talking about an organised drug trade? Who's using all that cocaine that has made Britain the cocaine capital? Because it ain't black people. It's the white middle classes of Notting Hill and Chelsea that like cocaine at the weekend, and black youth are dying in huge numbers, trafficking it across to those rich dinner parties at the weekend. So are we really born equal? So the persistence of race and class in the 21st century, the globalization of white supremacy, reinventing a myth that you can hold back to Darwin and others sent out by Elizabeth to colonize the New World. The indivisibility, it seems to me, of race and class. You cannot have one without the other, in my humble opinion. And when, in some ways, one of the greatest protests of our times is a young athlete simply going on bended knee to communicate his disgust, that connects you to a civil disobedience of Martin Luther King, of Mandela, of Gandhi and others so many decades before. This is the global moment, and it's absolutely a moment in which places like Harvard need to take a side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you so much. I can safely say that in the, I guess, almost 50-year history of the Du Bois Institute, this is the first time a member of Parliament has ever given an address, and you did it brilliantly. I know that there are a lot of questions and comments, but I have one. Just a footnote is that the redistribution of land was a fundamental problem in the United States. And for a minute, the confiscated land, over 700,000 acres confiscated from the Confederacy, was being distributed to the former slaves. And then when Andrew Johnson became president, well, he was already president, but then he reversed it within months. So land redistribution, as well as literally one man, one vote, were of fundamental importance to, because only men could vote, of course, was of fundamental importance to the new, what they call the birth of the Second Republic in this country. And both were snatched back. Land redistribution within months was snatched back. And then, to everyone's astonishment, in the Confederacy, when the Reconstruction Act allowed black men to register and vote in 1867, 80% of black men registered and voted. And not only the South lost its mind, but so did the North. So by 1873, with what was the first Great Depression, Reconstruction really was over. And by 1877, it was formally over. And after the sacrifice of 750,000 American lives to end slavery and reunite the North and the South, it was easier for the North to embrace the terrorist rebels than it was for either to embrace the freed slaves. Yeah. That is the scandal of Reconstruction and redemption. So my quick question is, all throughout, 3/4 of the way through your talk, if you had asked anyone, they would have said, he's saying class trumps race. But you ended with race trumping class, in a way. I mean, with the shocking statistics, 70% in Northern Australia and the Aboriginals. So you say that they're interconnected. But how do we do this dance of addressing the structural problems that are afflicting the poor in a multiracial society?
I mean, thank you so much, and thank you, Skip, for having me here in the first place. You know, your work has tremendous global reach, and so I am so grateful to what you do from this institution. I think that when you hold up land, as you do so powerfully in the American story, we have to do more in our scholarship to collect that to the global story. So where is the book and the books that connects the land issue in the United States to the land issue for indigenous people, by the way? You just catered reservations. The situation for the Aboriginals, the situations for the Inuit people and others in indigenous people in Canada, the land issues in Africa, the scramble for Africa, those straight lines that were drawn that you see on the maps, the land issue that is at the heart of the world's most perennial and persistent global controversy, which is in the Middle East, in the Palestine. You stand in Jerusalem and it is all about the land and where are the books? And then we ask the second question, which is at the heart of the capitalist project, is land. Absolutely, it is land. That is what the crash of 2008 is about. I, as a lawyer, the invention of intellectual property, the power of Google, an invention. It's all about property. You learn that as a first-year lawyer. This is at the heart of our system. And who is shut out of that system? So for me, I put race and class alongside each other. And I think in these tremendously dangerous times, and you can probably hear from what I'm saying, I think things, sadly, guys, are going to get a lot worse before they get better. This global attempt to hive off the white working class from the rest by the Bannions, the Farages, the Le Pens, this is dangerous. And we have to hold the two alongside each other and say, we stand in solidarity. So I'm reluctant to say one is better than the other. I just hold them together and think you can't easily have a discourse without the two of them, is what I would say.
Well, I think both of you agree. Thank you for your eloquence, though. It was just powerful, very much so. And because it is the case that the vast majority of black or brown people in prison are not members of the black or brown bourgeoisie,
yes,
then we don't have to worry about which trumps which, because it's always already both.
Yes.
And you got patriarchy working and homophobia working and so forth. But and Du Bois understood this in Black Reconstruction 1935. And this is Du Bois's Harvard. You know, we got our interpretation of this ruling class institution in the American empire. We got Du Bois telling those truths way back then. But my challenge to you, my dear brother, is what is the role of the neoliberal regimes like Obama and Blair that also refuse to come to terms with the rule of capital, which is to say their friendliness to Wall Street, their friendliness to big business in London, their facilitating of Iraqi invasions and occupations, roles in Pakistan and so forth and so on. These are all complicated. How do we remain persons who can work together and acknowledge the ways in which we're against the Trumps and the others, but still tell the truth about the Obamas and the Blairs in terms of their refusal to courageously hit Wall Street head on, hit mass incarceration regimes head on, and also, most importantly, hit empire head on, drone strikes. And you know the story, we on and on. But thank you so much.
Thank
you. Oh, Skip got those metaphors working here. Literally, but no, that's right, that's right.
And so good to see you again, brother. So good. And thank you for the question, because it's really important. So, you need to understand that more than anything, after 20 years in the UK Parliament, and maybe, I don't know, GQ making me Politician of the Year, it's kind of uneasy, GQ. It was me and two of the lead actors in Black Panther that were on the stage. It feels like GQ set a trend. Black is trending, I think was the message they were sending. But look, I treasure my independence more than anything. And I sometimes describe it to these, journalists. They're generally white, in powerful positions. I'm not sure they always understand what I'm saying. I say I've come to a place in my life where I'm like that taxi driver, that immigrant minicab. He's got his car, he pays his fuel, he's got a life story, and in this car is his independence. He hasn't got a boss telling him what to do. He hasn't got. It's all wrapped up, and I'm a little bit like that. So I'm a bit hard to place. I was in Tony Blair's government, Gordon Brown's government. I advanced. I was described as a moderate. I am great friends with your former president. And I say to my middle-class African-American friends, particularly when they give me the list of things that were not achieved by Barack Obama, I always say to them, I think he was the 44th president of the United States. Right. So I always say, listen, when we have had 44 black African-American presidents of the United States, then we can talk. The man was doing what he was doing his best, and he will always have my friendship. But I do recognize this neoliberal project and its huge limitations. It is why, in our race, I did nominate Jeremy Corbyn to lead the Labour Party. I also nominated in the race before that my colleague Diane Abbott as the first black woman to lead. It's not all, and let me just be clear, it was not because I agreed with everything that Jeremy Corbyn has said. And it wasn't because Diane and I have had some private big disagreements. But it was to say on behalf of the people I represent, and I'm not just talking about Tottenham, I'm talking about the great connection, it is my duty to shake up this race and be part of that shaking up process, that radical left-wing conversation that goes back to Du Bois and others. And there's sometimes a tension between head and heart in relation to that, so I recognize it. What I would say is, look, in the end, whilst we've got this vicious, awful white supremacist movement now taking place across the global world, it is in some ways still the baby boomers, a part of the baby boomers, trying to cling on to power. And I still have tremendous hope of the millennials when they get the reins. I do think it's a moment. And I don't know if it's as straightforward as neoliberals, left-wing socialists, right-wing fascists. There's got to be some new in this, and therefore there's a lot of thinking these millennials have to do.
Next question, please. Yes, Maria.
Thank you. Is this on? That was very powerful delivery. Thank you. My name is Maria Guo. I am a fellow here at the Hutchins Center for this year. I have a question for you more on the educational aspect of part of your presentation. So early on in my college years, a lot of my research work was focused on race relations, and I had this false impression that racism only exists in the U.S. And it wasn't until in my sophomore year that I had studied abroad in the U.K. that I was encountered microaggressions firsthand, that I came to this realization that racism is really unfortunately everywhere and universal. And I draw parallels to what you have covered today with in terms of history curriculum covered in schools, as Professor Gates has researched, said in his book, I believe only 18 states in the U.S. only require the teaching of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and only 19 states in the U.S. requires the teaching of Brown versus Board of Education. And again, going back to what you've covered about the omission of the concentration camps and the aspect of history, I was wondering what efforts are being put into the teaching of underrepresented community and the history that is largely forgotten. Like what is covered, what is being taught at primary schools, elementary school, and college. And that's what I'm curious about to hear. Yeah.
Very sadly, the United Kingdom has gone backwards. Michael Gove, the Conservative Secretary of State, had a look at the curriculum, and he scratched out the little that was there. When I was a minister, I put into our curriculum the abolition of the slave trade, particularly. Even that was scratched out and made an optional by Michael Gove. So it has gone backwards. This national story about the story that a country wants to tell of itself. He who wins the war tells the tale. And this contested history is really, really, really important for progressives to keep pushing hard. In some ways, we have to challenge politicians who fix this agenda. How do we make the agenda more independent so that perhaps universities like this one, who might be more independent in the discussion, have a greater say about the histories that we learn? I suspect it would be a little more balanced than politicians making these determinations, or elites, establishments of political nature making these determinations. But I'm afraid it's pretty grim in the UK, and I think it's why we're making this profound mistake that is Brexit. It is why so many poor people are being sold this myth of an empire lost that we can recreate. And it's also why it is absolutely the case, and this is the challenge here, in the European tradition, it's important not just to underline race, but to underline minority. The minority experience in this discussion. Here, you wouldn't describe African Americans as a minority. You might describe Native Americans as a minority, and there are real issues, I think, for them in that national conversation. But the struggle, if you are in France and you are Algerian or Moroccan, to hear your story and what that means for your own self-esteem. The struggle, if you are Jamaican or Nigerian or Ghanaian in modern London, to hear your story. When you look at Parliament and no one tells you that all that wood panelling, all that gold comes from your country and your ancestors' sweat and blood and tears, that is a myth that you are being told. And absolutely there is a fight back now, but I don't want to describe it as large, it's very small.
Doug.
David, thank you. That was very enlightening and moving. Can I ask you to say a little more about what sorts of responses people in this room and elsewhere should make to push back against the white supremacy that you describe? You've touched on some of these points. You talked about the books that maybe some people here should be writing, about education that should be different. What else do you see as the paths for action to make the difference, to make the 21st century what you described that it should be, rather than making the next decades just a reactionary movement to what has come so far?
So I indicated that I think in this pushback, the economic, the structural systems that are not just predicated on race, their economic systems, has to be part of the pushback. Or I'm afraid we run the risk that yet again in global history, white working class communities are sold a story that is so perniciously wrong that it's their fault, that they, the minorities stole this from you, when the story is actually that white elites shafted you and shafted them, is a story that we do not tell sufficiently. And perhaps because in the American tradition, class has never fully been on the table. You know, people like Martin Luther King were shot down when they were getting there. It never felt quite a rich scene. So that, it was interesting to be in the United States in the last election cycle, doing my review on criminal justice, and see the pushback that the Clintons were getting for their role in mass incarceration in the United States. Because again, if you're just seeing it through a race lens and not an economic lens that allows you, the 3 strikes rule and all that stuff, that basically that hits poor blacks, that sort of distinction about who gets what years for drug possession, you're not fully understanding the debate. So I think that here at Harvard, get into the economics, get into those land issues, get into the issues of why actually, let's not divide poor white people from poor black people. Get into the global movement. How are these people moving money around? What is going on? I mean, all the current debates, what is Russians' influence in this and why are they doing what they're up to with bots and other things? Get into that discussion and reveal these global connections and these global truths, and keep in mind the economics as well as the race discourse.
But David,
I would say.
The analysis we all share, that the exploited have more in common with each other than they do with the exploiters. But how in this country can you get the exploited white working class to remove the blinders of anti-black racism from their eyes so that they can realize that the people who have been demonized and whom they demonize are really their allies and not the white exploiters who are manipulating them?
Well,
that is a practical question.
It is a practical question, Skip, but it's in politics, when you're saying, I want to get your vote for me, you do accept in that constituency of people who haven't been voting to you that there is maybe a 25%, a core, who will never vote for you, right? So we've always got to look at who are the swing people among those folk. I think, there might be some room with the millennials within that group. And I'd have to know a bit more about the demography of that Trump-supporting group. Who are the people you can peel off within that? I then come to, I think the thing that America has done better than any single country in the world in the 20th century. And because of Hollywood, because of the story of immigration, this country has been the best country in the world at telling a story. It's never done better than the modern novel is written in the United States. So in a way, it's hard for me as a European to come here and tell you how to tell a story when you have been one of the best storytellers on the planet. You have to tell the story, and the story has to be persuasive. People have got to see themselves in those stories. I mean, I used to watch those documentaries, those Michael Moore documentaries. Sometimes need a little bit of editing, a bit of thinning down, those Michael Moore documentaries. But he wanted to tell stories, does tell stories, that people could kind of understand. And we've got to get back to that at every single level and peel off that millennial generations. So I have problems with slightly singular stories. I'm being a bit challenging here.
when we say Black Lives Matters, yes, of course, Black Lives Matters. I associate myself with all that you're doing. But, but by definition, you have branded that as singular and allow them to say, but white lives matter as well. So I think we need to think harder about some of that. And I don't think I need to tell the American soul how to tell a story when you are the best storytellers the planet has seen.
But we appreciate, we need all the advice
Even
that we
though some of them are missed.
We need all the advice that we could get. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time. Give it up for Member of Parliament, David Lammy.
That was great.